Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into a really tough, really complex piece of history. How indigenous peoples were displaced across North America and Australia. And it's a story that really comes down to colliding worlds, driven by totally different ways of looking at the land itself.
This one question from a Native American leader back in 1854, it just cuts right to the heart of the whole thing, doesn't it? It shows us that this wasn't just a clash of people, but a clash of entire worldviews.
So to really get a handle on what happened, we've got to first understand these two vastly different ways of seeing the world, because they were on a collision course.
Okay, so picture this. For thousands of years, you have hundreds of distinct native cultures thriving all across these continents. They were living in this incredibly deep, connected way with their lands. But then, starting around the 18th century, European settlers show up, and they bring with them a whole different set of ideas about everything from society and progress to, most importantly, land.
And really, when you boil it all down, this whole story hinges on one massive point of conflict. It's this difference in how each group saw the land itself, a difference that just couldn't be bridged. This quote here really paints a picture of that incredible diversity of indigenous life, right? It was all rooted in this deep relationship with nature, not a relationship of owning it. And that idea stretched into everything, including trade. When they exchanged goods with Europeans, they saw them as gifts, things you share based on your relationship and what people need. They weren't commodities with a price tag to be sold for a profit. And this really lays out the core conflict perfectly. On one side, you have this view of land as sacred, as a communal gift that you just can't own. But on the other side, you have settlers coming from Europe, where owning private land had become the key to wealth and power. For them, land was a commodity, plain and simple, something to be bought, sold, and used to make a profit.
So, you can see how these two ways of thinking were just completely incompatible. There was no middle ground. And this clash is what fueled this period of really rapid, forceful expansion by the settlers. The whole idea is captured perfectly in this one concept, the frontier.
Yeah, the American frontier, it wasn't just a line on a map. It was more than that. It was an entire ideology. It was this idea of a constant, almost inevitable push westward, moving into lands that, well, they weren't empty. They were already inhabited, of course.
This map right here tells that story without needing any words, really. You can just see how dramatically the United States grew in just a handful of decades. It just swallowed up these huge territories, and it was often done completely without the consent of the native peoples who'd been living there for generations.
And this push west was kicked into high gear by a few key events. You're talking about massive land purchases, the insane pull of the gold rush, and then ultimately a series of wars that ended with native tribes being defeated and forced onto reservations. All of this happened in less than 100 years.
And you have to look at the numbers to really grasp the situation. The demographic imbalance was just staggering. By 1820, settlers already outnumbered native peoples 15-1. An overwhelming difference like that was bound to have profound and pretty tragic consequences.
And we need to remember, this wasn't just about lines changing on a map. This had a real, devastating human cost. You look at something like the forced removal of 15,000 Cherokees, an event that became known as the Trail of Tears, and it just shows you the immense suffering that this expansion brought with it.
So, you might be asking, how on earth was all of this justified? Well, a whole new legal and social order was basically created to rationalize it all, to make the displacement of the original inhabitants seem, well, legitimate. And this happened both in America and, a little later on, in Australia.
Over in Australia, the British used this really powerful legal concept, or legal fiction really. It was called terra nullius, which is Latin for land belonging to nobody. Think about that. With that one declaration, they legally erased 40,000 years of Aboriginal history and presence on the continent. Just gone. This whole new system was built on a pretty clear racial hierarchy. Indigenous peoples were systematically denied basic rights, they weren't considered citizens, and the justification for this was labeling them as primitive or uncivilized. It effectively turned them into foreigners in their own homelands.
But of course, an injustice like this couldn't go unchallenged forever. As we move into the 20th century, the winds of change really start to blow. A long, difficult process of reevaluating this history finally began to take hold.
And you started to see these landmark shifts happening across both continents. In the US, you had acts that started to restore some rights. And in Australia, wow, you had a formal policy of multiculturalism, the legal system finally overturning terra nullius, and even national apologies. All of this signaled a really profound change in thinking. And this shift wasn't just happening in courts and parliaments. It was being captured so powerfully by indigenous artists and writers, like Ujuru Nunukul. Their work gave a voice to generations of loss, but also it celebrated this incredible resilience in the face of it all.
And so, all of this leaves us with a really critical question for today. Understanding this past is obviously the first step, but how does a nation truly reconcile a history like this with the ongoing fight for justice and equality? That is a challenge that very much continues to this day.